Okay, welcome everyone to the Watson Institute. I'm Catherine Lutz. I'm a professor here and co-director with Stephanie Savell and Neta Crawford of the Costs of War Project. So thanks for coming out to listen to our speaker today. We are meeting here on the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks to hear Dr. Neta Crawford describe her recent research. It's on one of the many, many consequences of that day. Their consequences not only or primarily even for the United States, but for the nations of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and now dozens of countries where the U.S. is waging a war on terror that was legitimated primarily on the basis of the horrific events of that morning 18 years ago. Back in 2010, our speaker and I noted that there had yet to be a comprehensive assessment of the impact of the war on the countries involved. And this, again, would include the human life, the toll in those terms, the financial health of the countries involved, and the socio-political foundations of those countries, often eroded in substantial ways. We found many researchers with expertise who were interested in working collaboratively on this, and the Costs of War Project over the next 9 years has evolved into a team of over 40 social scientists, physicians, human rights practitioners, and others who research the costs of the war in those countries. We post the resulting results on our website, which we had showing just up to a moment ago. You can get to it most quickly. It's on the Brown-Watson website, but costs of war, costs plural of war.org. We post the resulting papers on this website with summaries and infographics that distill our key findings and engage in vigorous media outreach. For example, several times in the last year, the New York Times editorial page has cited our work in calling for an end to the war in Afghanistan and also drawing attention to the problems of runaway Pentagon spending. Increasingly, we're working successfully to get our research findings into the hands of congresspeople and their staffers, and have had them used in Senate speeches and House hearings on the AUMF, the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, and Pentagon spending. Dr. Crawford will introduce some of our main research findings before going on to the climate consequences of war-related greenhouse gas emissions. She's professor and chair of the Political Science Department at Boston University, but more important, she has a BA from Brown, and she developed here her own concentration with the Brown curriculum, which it allows her to do. She called it The War System and Alternatives to Militarism. So she's been quite persistent in pursuing this passion to understand what has gone on, again, long before 9/11, but hopefully, again, to be mitigated with the alternatives that we can talk about. This demonstrates just one of the ways that a Brown education can lead one to make a huge difference in the world. Her more recent accomplishments are a book, Accountability for Killing, Moral Responsibility for Collateral Damage in America's Post-9/11 Wars, and the Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Ethics section of the International Studies Association just this last year. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments at the end of the talk, and look forward to this talk and discussion afterwards. And please come in, and there's plenty of seats up front.
Thank you, Professor Lutz. It's good to be home, if only for a brief visit. So I'm an international relations theorist and a scholar of the causes of war. So one of the causes of war is the belief that war is necessary, effective, controllable, and cheaper than the alternatives. On the anniversary of the attack that killed nearly 3,000 people, there are lots of ways to think about the costs and consequences of war. My focus has been in the project on death and injuries in the major war zones and on the U.S. budgetary costs. So the project estimates that the United States has spent about $5.9 trillion, or is obligated to spend up to that much through its responsibilities to veterans. And here you see, sadly, a distorted view. I don't think the slideshow is going to work because it's not showing all the the things on the slides, but I may switch out computers in a minute. It is the case that the United States has spent most of the money currently on defense spending by the Department of Defense and the State Department. That may go up to 6.2 trillion when we have an FY 2020 budget. Now, as you can see in this slide, we're at the peak, we're past the peak years of spending in the war zones, which occurred in the period from 2007 basically to 2013. A lingering effect, however, is the base military budget has increased. Even as you see, the red is the overseas contingency operations funding. The blue is base military spending, that is the operations that happen regardless of whether or not the U.S. is at war. And that's been increased as well over the period from 2001 to the present. So in this way, war emergency spending has been institutionalized into the base budget, the base military budget. Now, just to focus on Afghanistan for a minute, we see that expenses associated with veterans and interest on borrowing for the war will keep growing even after these wars end. Here's that same information presented a little differently. And again, I'm sorry that everything's not showing up here, but this is DoD appropriations. This is interest on the base. This is Veterans Affairs. And what is that? I forget. Something else. Additions to the Pentagon. No? Well, who knows? It's all there, though. So here's what it looks like in terms of deaths, right? So the project focuses on dollars, deaths, civil rights, contractors, the CIA, the expansion of the war zones. But here we look at the human toll, just in terms of numbers. And the United States and the Afghan government and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and so on have been killing a lot of civilians. And this is them in numbers. And I have a good number until mid-2019. This actually is on track to exceed all previous years, if we just look at what's been going on since June. So, as you can guess, the war is intensifying. So in total, it's more than 40,000 Afghan civilians who've been killed. And as we see, it's been getting worse for civilians. Now, here's an attribution of the causes of the deaths of civilians in Afghanistan. Who's doing the killing? It changes over time. So pro-government forces killing civilians has recently increased after a period when it was declining. And the Taliban is actually, and the other militant forces are responsible, however, for most death. So we also keep track of military deaths in the project. And here's a little slice of that. Total military fatalities for the U.S. is around 2,437 as of yesterday. Remember, about 3,000 people died in the 9/11 attacks. And here's the distribution of the deaths of U.S. soldiers and their allies over time. But now I want to talk about the main story today, which is my focus on fuel use in these wars and in general. So the U.S. military's dependence on fossil fuels began in the 19th century with coal for ships and railways. And it's most dramatic when you think about the transportation that was necessary to make the Civil War happen. In the early 20th century, diesel for trucks and tanks and gasoline for aircraft, jet fuel eventually became quite important. So their key tactical advantage is allowing for mobility. Through the late 1960s, the U.S. could supply the bulk of its fossil fuel needs with continental sources. There was an affordable price. In other words, oil was cheap. You could get it here. In the 1970s, a couple of things happened. There was the Arab boycott in 1973. The United States created a petroleum reserve, and that's partly in response to the boycott in 1975. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and then there was the hostage crisis in Iran. There were great fears that either the Soviets or perhaps a power in the Middle East would try to take over the Strait of Hormuz or somehow block the export of oil from the Persian Gulf. So the United States created the Rapid Deployment Force in 1979 to defend U.S. interests in the Middle East, including oil. In fact, preeminently oil. In January 1983, that became the Central Command, now CENTCOM. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the Bush administration reiterated their commitment to protecting access to oil. And it said U.S. interests in the Persian Gulf are vital to national security. And those interests, I'm quoting, include oil and the security and stability of free and friendly states, of key friendly states in the region. So in 1991, when the United States evicted Iraq from Kuwait, not only because of the fact of the invasion, but the fear that Iraq itself posed a threat of concentrating the large oil reserves in one state and posed a threat to Saudi Arabia, the United States acted. So all of this, this sort of development of the dependence of the United States military on oil and its use to protect oil is the backdrop for what I'm saying. Okay, so then energy is the lifeblood of our warfighting capabilities. It's the sine qua non. Without fossil fuels, the United States could not be globally dominant. So the United States has had a permanent presence in the Persian Gulf since 1991. With 1.5 aircraft carriers, 1 to 2 aircraft carriers there at any one time, generally, and those are nuclear powered, but they're accompanied generally by 10 surface ships. So Central Command is the orange part of the map up there in the middle. Now, in addition to that, obviously, the United States global presence includes other interests. So there's about 500 installations with about 560,000 individual buildings on those installations. Further, the global war on terror has increased operations to more than 80 countries thanks to Stephanie Savelle's map. We can see where they are and what's going on there. All of those require fuel. So, who brings it to the military? It's the Defense Logistics Agency. That's their job. And as you can see from this, they have locations all over the world. I didn't zoom in on the United States because it would just, but I wanted you to sort of imagine how many locations. There are some in Rhode Island even, where fuel is stored. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and so on. So U.S. energy consumption by the federal government is dominated by DoD consumption. The top line is total U.S. government energy consumption from 1975 to 2018 in British thermal units. Trillions of British thermal units. And the line just below that is the biggest user. That is the Pentagon. They're in any one year about 77 to 80% or so of total U.S. government consumption, production of energy. So you can see the dominance of the DoD again in this slide, where if you look at jet fuel, it's almost entirely DoD. We can't hardly see any blue. And the blue is civilian usage by other agencies in the federal government. So we're talking millions of barrels of Defense Logistics Agency procured and distributed oil. And here's what we see from 1998 to 2017. I'll just tell you a little story here about trying to find out all this information. It's not readily available. So I went to the Defense Department site. You can't find it. I went to the Defense Logistics Agency, and there's a little bit of data there. And then I discovered that even Congress is not told directly by the Pentagon what their consumption is, their purchases are. In fact, there's a line in one of the instructions for preparing the budget to give to Congress that says we, in fact, will not give them this information. It's specifically excluded. But it is findable. This is the Defense Logistics Agency petroleum product purchases over this period, which includes the war. And what do you see? What do you see here? Anybody? What do you see? What are the things that leap out at you? Anything?
Jet fuel really matches that total.
Right. Jet fuel is high, and basically it's dominating. Anything else?
Diesel's pretty consistent.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. Anything else?
2001.
Right, a big bump after 2001, and then a little what? A little dip? Anything else?
It's lower a little bit at the end.
Yeah, we're getting, in around 2014, the United States got to the point where they were around 2001. And one of the interesting things that we're going to discover is how is it that we're at war and petroleum consumption has gone down? So we'll think about that a little bit. So here we see another way of looking at consumption. And again, jet fuel dominates. This is the most recent year, the most recent data, fiscal year 2018, that is last year. Jet fuel dominates. There is a little teeny slice of renewables. And there's diesel, one of the next biggest slices, and electricity production, which could be from anything, including coal. Okay, and here we see the same data. There again, you see the dominance of jet fuel, but I'm also breaking out other different kinds of fuel: aviation gas, liquid propane gas, Navy special fuel. And this is the entire period for which I was able to get data. And again, another way of thinking about that, you probably can't read this, but the green is vehicles and equipment. That's the dominant use. Then the little blue slice and the orange slices are buildings. Okay, so that's the energy use by sector. So what do you learn from this? Transportation's key. Right, so what does the U.S. do? It gets places all over the world. It's the power projection capacity of the United States is dependent on oil. Oil is the lifeblood. Fossil fuels are the lifeblood, the sine qua non. Without this, you can't do anything. Cannot project power. Buildings use about a third of the energy. So here, we're going to just focus in on the installations for a moment. These are figures for Department of Defense installation consumption. Right, so the Department of Defense talks about their consumption in two baskets: installations and then operations. Okay, so the installations are the buildings. The 500 bases have these buildings, and this is what happens: the 560,000 buildings. So they're roughly, if you look at it carefully, what do you notice about the distribution? The services are, maybe you can't see this, but the Army is, of course, green. The blue is the Air Force. Defense agencies are the little, what is that color? Mauve. And then down here, what is that? Who can say? Oh, so the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy are here. We don't see the Marines. It's too little. It's about 4%. So roughly the installation energy use is what? It's constant, right? And the distribution really doesn't change between services. Okay, now we're deeply into the weeds, but let's go to the other weeds. This is operational energy use. That's 70% of what the Pentagon is consuming. And here we see, again, the dominance of what? Planes. It's by surface, so Army, Air Force, Marines, they get 4%. But we see the dominance of the Air Force here in terms of fuel use, projecting power. Now, why is this the case? Why are aircraft so thirsty? Well, if you look at some typical aircraft, that I've given you some examples here, the B-2, the new F-35 fighter, the older A-10 attack plane for close air support, the refueling tanker that's sort of standard, and the new refueling tanker. And you see that they get, between 2.4 gallons per mile, and nearly 5 gallons per mile. Now, the car I drove here today gets about 100 gallons per mile. I'm sorry, miles per gallon. Miles per gallon, right? Because it's electric assisted, so I get 100 gallons per mile. Miles per gallon. I'm stuck now. Miles per gallon. Okay, so there's a big difference between what we have in the civilian world and what we have in the military world. And why is that? Right? They have special capabilities. They're heavy, they're armored. So a Humvee will get maybe 8 miles per gallon, and now we're in the miles per gallon realm. A tank will get about, we're back to gallons per mile. Its tank is very heavy, right? So it needs more fuel, right? And then the aircraft has to go high, 70,000 feet, 100,000 feet, right? Travel at many times the speed of sound, Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3, right? So that's really inefficient, if that's what you care about. So, and then here I'm going to give you the big reveal. Okay. I've calculated, given the raw data from the Department of Energy, greenhouse gas emissions by the U.S. Department of Defense from 1975 to the present. Again, what do you notice? (1975) to the present. Right. Overall, a decrease. United States at war, there's an overall decrease. Okay, that's pretty cool. Now, if the Department of Defense were a country, where do you think it would rank? Okay, there's something like 200 countries in the world, right? So the Department of Defense, if it were a country, its emissions would be, its greenhouse gas emissions would be about rank number 50 from the top. So most countries produce in any one year less greenhouse gases than the United States military does, according to my calculations. And they don't dispute that. So what's that like? It's like Portugal or Sweden or Denmark in terms of its annual emissions. So these, on this slide, I'm showing you the standard, non-standard, and total emissions by category. So in the first column, what we see are total DoD emissions in millions of metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And I can go into the technical stuff in the question and answer if you want to understand what CO2 equivalent is, but it's the greenhouse gases, the main ones, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, standardized. So we see that from during the period that we've been at war, the Pentagon's released about or consumed enough fuel that it's produced 1,200 12 million metric tons of CO2, but only a portion of that can be attributed to these wars. And I estimate that of the total emissions, about 424 million metric tons. That is from 2001 to 2017. I wasn't able to quite yet do the calculation for 2018, but add to that. Okay, still a large amount. All right. So here's the same information portrayed differently. So non-standard operations are the things like installations, and then, standard operations are the things like installations, so that corresponds to the Pentagon's installations, and non-standard operations are the things you do in war. So there's my estimate for 2001 to 2017. It's a dramatic increase, and then steady, and then we're tailing off. So this is an estimate based on what I think the Central Command is using in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. And that's about 24% of non-standard operation by the DoD. But because U.S. counterterror operations are underway, as we said earlier, all over the world in 80 countries, Central Command is not the only war zone for the war on terror calculations, and that's why this is likely an underestimate, among other reasons. Certain other things are not estimated in this work. One thing that's very important are the emissions caused by military industry, which is 15% or so of all U.S. industry. Think about it. 15% of all U.S. industry is associated with military production. Then I don't count emissions caused by the direct targeting of petroleum, namely the deliberate burning of oil wells, refineries by all parties in the post-9/11 wars. So recall that Iraq detonated some of their own facilities in 2003. The U.S. has bombed oil facilities in Syria and Iraq to prevent ISIS from getting the revenue from those facilities. All of that can burn for months and in some cases years. And that produces carbon dioxide. So I can't count that. Somebody could, I haven't. There are sources of emissions by other belligerents, the UK, France, Italy, so on. I haven't counted them. I haven't, in fact, counted or tried to enumerate the emissions produced by reconstruction of damaged and destroyed infrastructure. Now, cement, concrete cement, actually has a very high greenhouse gas emissions profile. So the fact that we've destroyed infrastructure and need to repair it, and sometimes using cement, means that there's a lot of greenhouse gases there. And then I have not included emissions from other chemicals. Very fine, small amounts of fluorine containing chemicals. All right, so how does the Pentagon think about all this? Well, they're not thinking about greenhouse gas emissions per se. It's thinking about getting the oil and other petroleum resources where it needs to be. And here's a map of where it needs to be in the war zones, right? The little dots that you probably can't see that well are locations where the United States has stored or as little depots for oil. But then if you drill down into each facility, there's oil there. So that's what they're thinking about it. And they're worried because it's vulnerable to attack. And here's an example of the vulnerability of fuel transiting from Pakistan to Afghanistan. And what we see is there, in any one year from 2008 to 2014, there were dozens and in some years more than 100 attacks on those vehicles. So oil tankers are transiting from Pakistan to Afghanistan. When then they're damaged or blown up, that also causes emissions. But the U.S. military is concerned about this transit because they need to get the fuel there so that they can heat the tents or cool the tents using air conditioning and run all of their equipment. So the military's perspective on fossil fuels is get it to where it needs to be and make sure that it's not vulnerable to attack. So when it's vulnerable, they began to get the idea that they needed to cut the tether, as Mattis said, of fuel. Cut the tether, or at least reduce it. So what they've done is tried to reduce fuel use by having efficiencies and also by having alternatives. In fact, there's a little green part of the Marines that does brilliant work, making them light and untethered by giving them these portable solar arrays, larger solar arrays, and here we see a solar array sort of in the desert. But they're also doing things like making better batteries and helping people turn down the thermostats or up the thermostats in the tents as needed. All right, so it used to be, this is the big innovation that the Marines had in 2008. It used to be that each soldier, when they entered a tent, would adjust the thermostat to what they wanted, right? And some soldiers were too cold, some were too hot, so they automated this and they saved fuel. Sounds like this building. So automate it and you can create economies. Okay, so that's one concern, is decreasing vulnerability to attack. They're also concerned about the problems that climate change creates for operations. You know, you hear a lot of talk about how now that the Arctic is open, the Russians want to be there. You also, if you pay attention to the military, hear about how they're concerned that they're going to have to take on missions that they didn't want to take on, for instance, or maybe they do want to take them on, but they're outside their remit, like rescuing people, like providing airlift and sea lift in times of crisis, to evacuate people who are at risk from climate change catastrophe, like much more intense hurricanes. So they see this as sort of outside their regular mission, and they'd rather not be doing it. It just takes away resources from the thing they'd rather be doing, which is preparing to defend the United States or project power. So the other thing that they care about is the vulnerability of their bases to climate-related impacts. And here in the map are some of the sites that are already experiencing multiple climate-related vulnerabilities. And the picture of the flooded base, that's Offutt in Nebraska during the March of this year because of intense rains. And then here what you see on the far right is Norfolk Naval Base. And this is you see in the various colors the effect of flooding. So the worst flooding and hurricane are the red. But there's lots of, this is all meant to be land here. But what you see is most of it's covered in water. So that's a concern. So the concern here is resiliency and trying to make sure that the bases are not dramatically affected, or maybe in some cases moving them. They may close Tyndall Air Force Base, for example, which was devastated by a hurricane a year and a half ago. So the other thing that they're thinking about is the connection between climate change and war. Now, there's nothing necessary about this, but they're concerned that climate change, that is the stresses on human survival caused by climate change, will lead to conflict. So here's a little graphic that tells you that drought might lead to crop failure, which would be associated potentially with migration. There might be internally displaced people who want to move to a neighborhood near you. There are economic migrants because of climate change. We see this already, right? But what the military is concerned about are some of these conflicts turning into wars. and creating instability. And then they have to be able to respond. What they're not talking about is the fact that their own greenhouse gas emissions make these outcomes much more likely. Okay, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this paper. I wanted to show how there's a disconnect between what the military is preparing for, its behaviors, and the outcome it doesn't want, how it's making that outcome more likely. So, because they're not looking at their own role in the climate crisis, I thought we should look at it for them. And that's what I've done. So I'm prepared to take your questions. I think I've gone less than what you asked me to do.
That's wonderful, and can I ask the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things that I find fascinating is when you follow the popular press, one of the arguments that's made very frequently is that the Department of Defense has been at the vanguard of doing these environmental fixes and have been, greening themselves for years and very successfully. But your data shows there's no discernible effect, nor, well, in comparison with other agencies of government, that they rise and decline in tandem. So they obviously have incredible public relations efforts put into convincing the American public that they're a sort of a vanguard institution in lots of ways, racially, but environmentally. And so this data, do you feel like that this data can contest that argument that they've done everything in a way that's been more successful than their peers?
They have a great incentive to do certain things like reducing the vulnerability, and they do that really well. And they've been very innovative. I think that we can give the Marines in particular credit for being innovative. It is a drop in the bucket of their consumption. Now, when I break down the decline, I can it pretty much correlates with the declining use of coal by the military. So this is a change that's happened all over the United States and indeed the world, reduction in the use of coal. There are other changes. I don't think they're particularly innovative, but some of them are innovative and forward-looking, and I think that should all be applauded. But the deeper question of what are the missions that the United States has that require it to be in these distant places doing these actions is not thought about by the military. I think it's beyond their remit.
Okay, so open the floor to questions. And we have microphones for any of the questions.
Hi. Yeah, I just have a clarifying question, just to say a little bit more about that decrease you showed us in the emissions since 1975, despite the fact that we are at war.
Right, okay. So let's go back to that slide. Look at it a bunch of different ways. Let's look at the big picture. So, United States left Vietnam in 1975. Is this still on? No. Can I have that? Okay, left Vietnam in 1975. Still in the Cold War, right? Here we see some rising and falling depending on what's going on. So there are modest interventions, right? But then at the end of the Cold War, it declines. There's less the word I'm looking for is practice. It's
The military shrinks.
the military does shrink. The military budget does decrease, but they're doing less things like operations with NATO. Okay, they're not practicing war as much, right? So there's less operational use, right? That's it. Exercises. I knew there was some anodyne word that was escaping me. Exercises. Okay, and they're also closing some bases. There's base realignment and closure, right, for some of this. And then obviously, in the invasion of Afghanistan, well, you see a little peak in 1991 with the Gulf War. And some fuel is actually donated, by the way. So I don't have that. So I think this would be higher if I had the donated fuel by neighbors. Then we see a decrease, but the United States is still operationally active in the 1990s in Europe in the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo. And then again, you see a decrease. So what I'm saying, Stephanie, is that it's correlated with activity, right? But then the general downward trend is those things like, I'm pretty sure, the reduction in the use of coal, which is, if you compare coal with any other fuel, it's just so much more greenhouse gas intensive, right? It's sort of outsized in its weight. And a little bit of a reduction in diesel. Again, outsized. And so greater efficiencies there, right? And then in addition, they're concerned about the vulnerability so that they've got efficiencies out in the hinterlands, right? So that's why people have big batteries and those solar panels, so they don't have to transport it. So there's some economies there. So it's basically a story of economies, some base realignment and closure, then the reduction of certain fuel use. But I haven't tracked every last drop of it.
And what do you say, there have been, like, naysayers who'll say, oh, you know, actually in the context of overall US emissions, the DoD is just a drop in the bucket. It's actually not that much compared to, you know, everything else we do. So what's your answer to that?
I think every country that's below the number 50 would feel like that's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so it's larger than many countries, most countries in the world. That's one thing that's a clear response to that. And the second thing is the United States military has the opportunity, as it converts to renewables, and there has been some conversion to renewables, to actually push a sector. Its huge capacity in terms of buying power could actually push the renewable sector. So they buy solar fields, or they put up their own solar. They have some geothermal. If they converted, it would have an enormous effect, decreasing the overall price of renewable energy and making it more attractive. Okay, so there's a potential lever there for greening. Look, we need everything. I'm going to show you a slide I didn't show you, because we need everybody to do everything. There it is. This is atmospheric CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. This is the so-called hockey stick. This is our emissions. We have to dramatically decrease emissions. Right? How do you decrease emissions? Well, stop doing some things that you're doing that are not necessary or indeed counterproductive, and some of those include war. And also increase the use of renewables. This is, you know, I don't need to tell you, every day you're confronted with climate catastrophe, right? So everything is necessary. I haven't eaten meat for 45 years, thank goodness, otherwise I'd have to stop, right? Because it's not good for the planet because of the methane, and methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. And the nitrous oxide that's associated with the fertilizers, right? All of us can make a change, but the sort of irony of the military spending a quarter of its fuel to protect access to oil, which we don't need, and if we burned it would kill us, it should be very clear. Yes.
Thank you. David Burbach, Naval War College. One quick point before my question on the jet fuel, on the slight decline in jet fuel usage over time. You might look into, particularly as the older C-141 and C-5 cargo planes get replaced with the more efficient C-17s. That might be part of it, but you know, generally increasing efficiency. The larger question, I guess, would be to is ask you to think about distinguishing between things the military can control versus larger political decisions. And I've looked through the report, and I actually like the very practical suggestions that you've got about ways that DoD might try and improve energy efficiency on bases, more renewables. At the higher level, though, ultimately the military is not deciding to initiate and continue these wars. That's ultimately a political system question. So, and when it comes to those large-scale operations, we don't yet have a good replacement for jet fuel or a good way to replace, sending things into a war zone, that don't involve being on an airplane for things that need to get there quickly. Like, we're not going to send people by ship anymore. So, what sorts of things would you suggest that DoD focus on that are within its control in the near term? And what would you suggest are going to require a much more broad political decision to reorient priorities?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think is underlying your question is this sort of neat division of labor between the civilians and the military. So the DoD is over here, and in the Pentagon doing its thing, basically at the behest of people who are in the National Security Council and the White House. I actually don't think it's that neat, and I'm sure you actually don't either, because the NSC uses plans and options generated in many cases by the military and responds to scenarios generated by the military. But the larger point you're making is absolutely right. It's a stimulus response system. The stimulus comes from the White House. They say, do this, go there, kill these people, protect this thing. And I think that this is a larger political discussion, which is why I began the recommendation section with getting more information about what's going on, and it is a political discussion. But I think I don't want to accept that it's that neatly separated. Actually, there's a little bit of play back and forth. And then for more things that the military could do, and the military wants to do this. They've asked over and over again for another round of base realignment and closure. And they've asked and asked and asked, and it's not happened. And that's because there are bases in every state and other things in every state. And we have to make it the case that when a politician says, maybe we should rethink this vulnerable base or this expensive base or this unnecessary base, it could be closed. Now, again, installations are 30% of the profile, but every little bit counts, right? And then we have to think about procurement. And I don't think that, let's say the F-35 is a much more efficient plane. I'm not actually sure that it is a much more efficient plane, but there are some of the tankers are more efficient. I don't think that that's necessarily a rationale for getting the tanker. We have to have a larger strategic discussion, and that would, for my money, begin with a question of what are the real interests the United States has in the world? Real interests that would be threats. Qualify those threats, quantify those threats, and then think about a posture that goes to respond to those threats. And that's not the kind of thing that has happened in the United States in a real serious way post 1945. We sort of, it's like a Rube Goldberg machine, where thing is piled upon thing, and bases are left over from the past, and missions are just taken for granted. We had the mission of protecting access to Persian Gulf oil in 1980 to the present, but our dependence on Persian Gulf oil is much less than in the past, right? And we've got the strategic oil reserve and so on. So there's a lot of things that could be done.
Hello, my name is Anaji. I'm a sophomore. This is sort of a follow-up to the previous question. So I'm a climate justice activist. I'm involved with Sunrise here on campus and also a group called 0 Hour. But I guess I'm wondering, in climate movement spaces, the strategy has generally been to focus on elected officials and trying to pass the Green New Deal, which I'm sure you've heard about. But is there any capacity for organizing specifically towards the military? Because obviously many of Pentagon officials are not elected. And so I'm just wondering if there's any way for direct activism in that realm.
Yeah, I think that follows on very nicely from the previous question. I think that it's elected officials, but I live in Medford, Massachusetts, which is a lovely town along the Mystic River, right, in Massachusetts, which is where, John Winthrop set up shop, right? It's really great. And it's the home of shipbuilding, and we've got a climate action plan for the city of Medford. And I live right on the river, right? So the climate action plan shows my house looking pretty precarious in a bit, right? So think locally, act locally is what I do. So I'm on the Medford Tree Committee. What do? We plant trees, right? Trees are a tremendous part of the greenhouse gas solution. So I don't think that any action is off the table, but I believe that local action is essential, and there you'll have more leverage. So that's my response. Though, I think in addition, when people say, how are you going to pay for the Green New Deal, they need to look at the overall federal budget and see that the Department of Defense sucks up quite a bit of those resources, and even the DoD, which cannot pass its own audit, realizes that there's room there for efficiencies.
And I would just add also that the budget for defense overall, the defense budget, which gets approved every year, is a real mechanism and lever for a lot of advocacy groups on this issue. So to be able to connect the climate justice issue with there are a lot of groups who are working on reducing the Pentagon budget, and that is a channel to get at the elected officials who have some say over what the military is doing, and it's kind of making those they call them intersectional connections between social movements in different fields that actually I think what Neta's paper does really well is show that anti-war activists are climate justice activists, and vice versa, right? So making those connections is really key.
Yeah, show up for each other's rallies and actions.
Thank you for the talk. I just had a question related to this idea of air power. I think one thing your paper did
Idea of what?
of air power. I think one thing this presentation did really well was also outline the influence of like jet fuel in terms of U.S. military policy, similar to what the British did in the Middle East. But I'm wondering where drones fit into this broader analysis. Like with the discourse of war, do you give weight to the kind of argument that says that they're more efficient or better for the military than other alternatives?
Okay, so drones do three things. They do reconnaissance, right? So they're all constantly taking pictures. They kill, right? And then they do more reconnaissance after action. They take more pictures to see who they killed, right? So some of them are up there, big eyes in the sky, and they don't kill. They're not Reapers or the other one. And some are doing both, right? So I think that the argument about drones is in part about personnel. You need fewer personnel, which is actually not quite right, since you've got to have four, I don't know. There's a lot of people involved in maintaining drones. And it's not clear to me that they're more fuel efficient because they're up there longer, right? So I'm ambivalent about that. I think the question with drones is their mission. So I would step back and think about what are the drones doing. And when they're doing reconnaissance, that's a little bit more benevolent. Now, you have to then ask yourself, well, do you think that the United States should be engaged in targeted killing? What's the legality of that? What are the ethics of that? Is targeted killing assassination? If targeted killing is assassination, then it's against international law. It's unethical as well, right? But in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, drones are not really the big emitters. Could they substitute? No. They can't substitute for the missions, for the most part, because they don't have big enough payloads, right? A drone can carry a couple of missiles. We're talking many more missiles on a F-35 or, a lot more capacity on an A-10. They just do different things. There's not a one-to-one trade-off. I think the question of drones is the whole, that's like, do you believe in killing people or this kind of reconnaissance? You think that's better than sort of boots on the ground? Or does the killing of people through drone strikes lead to more boots on the ground? Because it's a whack-a-mole problem.
There's one more.
Thank you for your presentation as well. Did one of your slides indicate that you did not calculate the emissions from the industrial complex that supplies the military? In other words, by showing the Marines being really good guys and using solar, but it doesn't count how much it costs to build the solar in emissions, correct?
Well, I haven't calculated the emissions of any particular piece of equipment's production. So no, but I know that about 15% of America's industrial capacity, the United States industrial capacity, is used to produce weapons and other equipment. Right, now, the Marines generally buy their solar from commercial vendors. In fact, all of the services and the DoD itself buy certain things just straight, commercially. So I'm not into that level of detail yet. I might be able to do that in the future.
So you simply couldn't take the figure 15% and multiply that times the emissions that's put out by all U.S. industries.
One could, and I could give you a crude number, and that would be enormous, right? But here's the thing. Not every industry, this is really micro, right? It would be a microanalysis, and I can't do that yet. Not every industry is producing the same thing. So let's say Boeing is going to be more greenhouse gas intensive than somebody who's making a uniform. Just that kind of comparison, right? Or tanks will be more greenhouse gas intensive.
I just have a quick question
Yeah,
from
sure.
our live stream on Facebook right
Okay.
now.
Oh, the live stream on Facebook.
Yes.
I don't even have Facebook.
Ellen McGirt is asking about one of your background facts. She's saying Afghan civilian deaths highest in 2018 since 2001 and getting worse. She just wondering why that's the case.
Okay. So you've probably heard that the United States was engaged for about a year in negotiations with the Taliban, and that those negotiations, such as they were, fell apart recently. So during the run-up to getting to an agreement, both sides had intensified their fighting and are still engaged in much more intense fighting because they're trying to take over land to have as a bargaining chip to show how powerful and awesome and wonderful they are. So civilians get hurt in the crossfire. And in addition, the Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda sometimes deliberately target civilians, even though the Taliban says that they don't want to, they're not supposed to. They do. So that's why. In other words, let's go back to that slide. There's a couple slides there. Here it is. Yeah, that's right. 2018, the worst year. I think 2019 will be worse. That's my guess. And it's because of this intensification. Now, when you look at the next slide about who's killing who, you see that it varies, right? So when pro-government forces, which is the solid line, in 2008, they realized the general in charge there, McChrystal, In fact, McKiernan before him, but then McChrystal realized that the United States was killing an awful lot of civilians via air power, and that this was counterproductive. And he said, we're going to lose this expletive-deleted war if we keep killing civilians. And so in July of 2009, they put in a directive saying we're going to reduce the use of air power in certain situations. And then you see a decline for a while in civilian death caused by pro-government forces. And that kind of attention to protecting against civilian casualties goes up and down depending on the people in charge and the situation on the ground at any one time.
Just one more.
On your death chart here, how do you get the anti-government forces killing so many people? Where's that figure come from? I mean, we don't have anyone in the field counting dead bodies.
Well,
Vietnam,
yes,
we were lied to like hell in Vietnam. They were saying they were killing
sure,
Viet Cong, and they weren't.
sure.
So I look at that and go, wow, no Air Force or anything. We're bombing the hell out of Afghanistan, and yet we're not killing as many
So-
people as the Taliban. Right.
Okay, so let me just explain. This chart is looking at civilian deaths, and what I've got here are deaths from 2008 to 2018, and the previous slide has to the middle of this year. Where does that data come from? It comes from the United Nations, has a group of people who investigates every incident of civilian or suspected civilian death. So what they do is they go to try to figure out who killed these people. Yes, there are people on the ground looking at civilian deaths. Now, how is it that they have the capacity to look at all of these incidents? Well, when you compare this to Vietnam, there are many fewer civilians being killed. Okay, now then how does the Taliban manage to kill so many civilians? There's two ways. One is they have suicide attacks and other attacks which are deliberately targeting civilians for intimidation. And another is they leave improvised explosive devices out, and civilians are harmed by those, kind of willy-nilly. Unexploded ordnance kills people. So that's how it happens. Now, they have said that they're not intending to intentionally kill civilians, but I think that their actions speak louder than their words in this case.
Can I ask one other question? The environmental effect of military operations includes this incredible impact on greenhouse gases, but it also includes toxins. And understanding where there might be data. Do you have a sense of where there might be data to look at that in Afghanistan in particular? All these bases have various problems. There have been very recent measurements of PFAS, a toxin that has been found in firefighting foam-related water plumes outside of lots of military bases. So there's a lot of examples, but do we have any examples from the war zones where there's data on those kinds of spills, intentional, unintentional use of
I don't.
pollution of water sources?
I don't. I didn't look at that. I could barely wrap my head around doing the calculations.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But the bases are a toxic problem for here as well, not just there. The bases are military bases because of what they do. They, for instance, have to clean their jets very well. They add chemicals to the fuel and to make them fly high and not have water vapor, so on. It's just a chemical soup.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for the questions and for the talk.
Thank you.